What's going on, beautiful people? Welcome back to week 10 of Community Permaculture. Thank you for joining us. Stoked to share this info with you. There's some really cool stuff on this list. It kept growing, and I finally was able to cut myself off. This, epic final chapter I was trying to make incredibly epic, and I think I need to make it a little bit less epic and chill out and just give you all the reading information and then do what I was attempting to do this week, which is kind of sum up the course and give you a broader sense of, what sort of, not takeaways, but synergies and syntheses we can pull out of this material and attempt to organize it for you a little bit better. I think what I'm going to do is, instead of trying to do that for this week 10, I'm going to give you a final course lecture, so to speak, coming up. After that, I won't contact your email unless you request to be on a mailing list, in which I'm going to essentially continue doing this sort of a course, although on a more bi-weekly or monthly basis. So it will be a little bit less often, probably a little bit lighter for the most part, although I might dig really deep. I might send you some blogs, might send you some personal videos of me doing stuff in different places. So anyways, if you'd like to continue to receive stuff after this week 10 and this final lecture, please just let me know. Say, hey, I want to be on your mailing list. Put me on there. I'll get you on there. But let's get into it. For this week, we're looking at a number of different specific systems, food forest sort of systems or agroforestry systems, which have stood the test of time, which have indigenous knowledge embedded into them, aka knowledge of place from people who lived in places for long periods of time and worked with the specifics of that place. In addition to that, we've got some more sort of global perspectives, comparative perspectives, some other general deep dives, and specifically some work on Indigenous and BIPOC-led stewardship and innovation. So the first, if you don't have time to watch one lecture, the first lecture on here, Leah Penniman's keynote address, which I believe comes from her work. She has a book, I believe, entitled Farming While Black, and she's done a number of speeches based on the book, in a sense, from what I've gathered. I haven't read it yet, I haven't got it yet, but from the speeches, it sounds amazing, and even just the speeches are themselves works of art. Really brilliant, scintillating with story, obviously filled with personal involvement and investment, and at the same time a global perspective. I can't really summarize what she says, but suffice it to say, what I appreciate about what she's doing is she's, on the one hand, pointing out, here are the realities of our contemporary American, and I mean, mainly U.S., but also North and South and Central American food system. This system based on stolen land and stolen labor, which is, killing the basis for our existence. This system which generated and depended on, rather, slavery and then sharecropping and then prison labor, and now currently an immigrant labor force, which in a way is itself the product of that system, has, been influenced to move north and move away from their families and move away from the land. They were born on the land, they love the people they love, to work the jobs that we don't want to work here, like picking our food, by the very system, the broader system of capital itself, which creates climate chaos, creates unfair trade agreements, she points out, creates wars, creates natural disasters, and or makes the conditions for recovery from natural disasters harder. All of those things add to a situation where you have this real legacy of what another article in the readings today, which I actually read for you out loud, so you don't even have to go read it with your own eyeballs. You can just listen to it. Points out is itself based in the Roman latifundia, or the Roman plantation system. Why is that significant? Of course, yes, many cultures have had different forms of monoculture agriculture and even grain agriculture. And I'm sure the Romans had themselves a model that they were looking back to. But because the Roman Empire attempted and successfully essentially expanded itself to cover most of Western and Central and most of Eastern Europe as well, depending on how far you extend those borders. And then those parts of Europe, especially Western Europe, expanded themselves to the entire globe. The legacy of that form of feeding an empire is directly relevant. So what I see Leah Penniman doing is really tracing the fairly recent, last 500 or so years history of the effects of this monocultural, extractive, capitalist spin on essentially an ancient imperial practice. Having slaves, needing to make war to get slaves to work the land, to produce in these giant, sort of oversimplified and extractive land use practices. So while she does that on the one hand, and while that can be very difficult stuff to listen to look at, to some extent for some people in certain circumstances, it's not always fun, and or it raises feelings of fear, of guilt, of despair, of all these things. She's someone who, on the other hand, as she knows about those, sort of the dark knowledge of the realities of things we're facing, she also has decided that she wants to move in a different direction, wants to help move all of us in a different direction, wants to listen to ancestral voices, wants to listen to voices that are otherwise suppressed by that kind of imperial monocultural colonial system. And she's put her money, so to speak, and her hands and her manos where her mouth is, and fed people where our mouths are, and fed people actively with that knowledge, and said, okay, I'm going to do something different. I'm going to create a farm. I'm going to create a space. It's not only going to be a farm. Along with her family, she's created a farm that is also a safe space for organizers to gather, a teaching space where she creates content and leads workshops and classes that really impact people's relationship with land in a positive way, and help people who might associate, say, land with slavery and with, in other words, as she says, associate the scene of the crime with the crime itself. She's doing work not only to feed people, but to dissociate those unnecessary sort of contaminations of our relationship, or I don't know if she would say our, because she specifically focuses on Black, Indigenous, and people of color who have been actively alienated from the land. She talks about Black farmers in America going from 14%, which was more than the percentage of the population in, I'm fudging the dates, but 1900 or so, to less than, 0.2% or something nowadays. And the history of land use practices, or rather of land grabs, essentially, by white neo-settlers, all the way up to redlining, but back to lynchings and various things that pushed Black people off of the land, off of being owners of the land and producers. And I think her perspective on this has both the moral authority of historical awareness and the moral authority of active participant in contemporary reality, who's in so many different ways putting her life on the line to make sure that something changes. And so to that end, her presentation, her style of storytelling, her personal involvement with the material, her amazing smile, and being upbeat and undefeated, sort of, while she looks into these things and still goes, you know what, we have choices to do something better. All of that I find incredibly inspiring. I hope you do too. I've gone on for quite a bit about her and her stuff, but I hope you also really fall in love with the work and with the perspective and with the mind and the creativity and the community that's behind what she's doing. It's super cool. So please do check out Soulfire Farm, which is her farm. There's videos on it. I'll include a couple just general sort of news reel sort of takes of like what they're doing, and then an article by her as well as some articles that I think her article might have led me to, including stuff on the origins, the often lost and intentionally effaced origins of a lot of this modern organic farming and permaculture and things like that, are in a way rebrandings of ancient indigenous knowledge and or of, say, more contemporary black thinkers like Booker T. Whatley, who's someone I didn't know about. There's obviously Booker T. Washington, I believe, who's more well known. Whatley pioneered the CSA model, which is the sort of participatory agricultural model. So there's more stuff by her about her farm, inspired by her, etc., that you can look at your leisure. But dude, definitely the lecture is very comprehensive and a great introduction to a very important perspective. So that being said, if you have time to watch 2 videos, the other one I would add to that list would say check out the Vandana Shiva, and I know we've heard a number of times from her already. This is a recent lecture delivered fairly recently at Dr. Elaine Ingham's Soil Food Web School. I don't even know if I'd call it a lecture. I think it's more of a conversation, if I recall correctly. And once again, her global perspective is crucial. And between the two, it's 50 minutes and 30 minutes or so. So it's about an hour and 20 minutes. Again, feature-length film, and hugely, I believe, positive investment in your knowledge base and ability to think about, in Vandana Shiva's case, they're totally related or dovetailing at the very least. In Vandana Shiva's case, though, specifically, she focuses on the commoditization of life and of the source of life, of seed. And if I recall correctly, some of that talk goes into details we haven't heard about yet. So I would recommend you check it out, even if you're like, I've already heard about her and her shtick. I still think that that's an incredibly important, broad perspective to have. If you'd like some more sort of practical and feel-good and very interesting thoughts, check out The Forest Gardener by Harris Pascal. So he ran through and I saw this before, and I recently rewatched it, and it reminded me that there's a section in there that I hadn't really looked up everything he was talking about. And in that section, he talks about various forms of ancestral agroforestry practices which have stood the test of time. So one of these I didn't know until I tried to spell it, and I couldn't figure out what he was saying and how to spell it, and I finally looked through a bunch of articles on Mediterranean food forests and found this term Dehesa. I didn't know how that was spelled, but it's a southern Spanish oak savanna agroforestry system, or agro-pastoral silvopasture, I guess, because they're running animals through it. But it has outlasted all the empires and plagues, and it's 4,000 plus years old. It's an ecosystem that humans have stewarded, and his talk reintroduced me to thinking about these agroforestry systems as potential urban, having potential urban applications, since he talks about how his, I think, some Australian city, God, he said it so many times, I can't remember, Cambridge, Canberra, something. Sorry, dude. Anyways, great video on food forests and how do we grow food forests that can outlast us as a civilization even, and or help us outlast the bullshit that is out there trying to come for us. So the Dehesa system, we're going to hear more about that in a moment. He talked about other ones. Why I focused in on that one, essentially we live in a very similar climate. We also have oak savanna here in California. We live in a Mediterranean climate. We could learn a lot directly from that system. So there's a whole section you'll see down there on the Dehesa system of southern Spain and southern Portugal. But the Forest Gardener, if you had time for, say, a third video, I'd say that one is a little more it doesn't dive into the problem, so to speak, which is not necessary. I mean, it does sort of touch on it in through another angle, maybe a little bit less of a social angle, or maybe not. Maybe I'm being blinded to my own critical leanings or something like that, and feeling better about that one. Interesting choice of language, Colin. But yeah, he gives us, hey, here's these ancient examples, and we can do it too today, and I like that, and I recommend that one. We've got another one on inclusive land care practices, where you see actively a white, upper college degree representative of Western science, who is actively on stage demonstrating a posture that I think Western science and academia should take more generally. Namely, she's listening to an indigenous person and collaborating with an indigenous person on the land restoration practices that she is, for whatever reason, by the participation in a university or something, endowed with the power to do. So instead of just exercising that colonial power, as in, I'm going to go fix your land and tell what plants to grow where, and protect and save your aboriginal native flora and fauna, she's dialoguing with a representative or a member of a community of indigenous people who have a direct relationship with and knowledge of the land that is in question. So I think we need more of that. I think we need more of that listening, more of that dialogue, more of that positioning indigenous thinkers as the reference to which Western science should refer itself, I guess. You know what I mean? So instead of this kind of we know best approach, this colonial, crusader approach with ecology, where we're going to go out and fix your brown people's world that we messed up because we know best, this demonstrates maybe let's listen and then see what we can do. So that one's comes recommended on here, although I don't have a star by it, just in part because of the content. It's not something that but the form that I described there is what I think I'd like you to take away from that. And I think the specifics of that particular landscape, which it seemed focused a little bit more on conservation and sort of saving endangered species, which is incredibly important, is going to take a backseat to some extent to providing food for people right now, and to prevent, I think to save species out in the wild, so to speak. I think humans in the cities should be fed and can be fed as a prerequisite to that, right? If you have social unrest, you don't have the conditions for good conservation. But if you have some sense of social satiety and people have what they need, there's a little bit more chance, hopefully I'm right about this, that we will do what's right by the environment. The next video, John D. Liu, again, we're hearing from John D. Liu on ecosystem restoration, and this talk is on ecosystem restoration camps. It really goes through a lot of his stuff you've heard from him before, but I love what he's doing. I love how he's thinking about things. I love how he's seeing things. So again, this is recommended. It is not required in any way. I do then have another one that has a star next to it. This is John Todd, The Ecological Design Revolution. In part, because on the one hand, I do think that fusing new technology with ancient knowledge is, in a sense, our salvation, is what, we're going to need. Very simple solutions, very elegant ancestral solutions, and we also, I think, might need new engineering, so to speak, new quote-unquote engineering. On the positive side of his talk, what I see him doing is gathering the biomimicry data, let's learn from nature and apply it to how we engineer things. And I love that, and I think we all need to be doing that in some kind of way. How do we learn from how nature did things super intelligently, take it into our approach to making smartphones or to making subway system in a city or whatever it may be. We're going to probably live in cities. We're going to be surrounded by technology of some sort. So I would rather be surrounded by a technology that has respected and learned from nature. That being said, I think to some extent, and maybe just my own traumas and the idea of Western science and engineering being tainted somehow by its colonial legacy and my own sort of school relationship with the sciences and the hard sciences rather. I think there is something to be said for the concept of engineering in Western academia and Western science. To some extent, views beings as stuff, and even formerly living beings, wood or sawdust or something that was once part of a living being. Just some of his language to me borders on, as much as I love what he's doing, I want to use some of the self-questioning that I think the other lectures, the Leah Penniman in particular lectures, lead me to. I want to use that self-questioning to think through, I'm not a fan of this term, but the problematic nature of some of our Western eco-saviorism. And I think one of the fundamental things that Leah discusses at various points in her lectures, and I think Vandana Shiva also discusses this, is when you see the world as dead and as filled with a bunch of dead things that you can just manipulate as stuff, essentially, you disenchant the world. Western science had that disenchanting impetus really strongly built into it, and it led to the Reformation and Enlightenment, and that's not all bad or anything. I'm not trying to say that, but it might be something that we need to shed if we want to move forward out of some of the barbarism which our progress and advancement has led to. And I think tech itself, or like treating nature as a machine, when you start to see nature as a machine, there's just danger in that, to me, to my ears, to my not ready to receive the AI overlords quite yet, and not ready to, I guess, bust out of the matrix and see the determinism that really runs everything as that. To me, that's in a way an enlightenment nightmare, an enlightenment fantasy that's become a living nightmare. Again, technology is not all bad. I'm using this technology to speak with y'all. I don't think you can look at technology as an extension of nature, just like you can look at nature as a form of technology. Neither of those are inherently wrong. But what happens when you instead see the formerly living material that you're going to use for your worm farm or whatever as something that was alive, something that had a mother, something that had a father, something that had a life, that has ancestors, and that even has a future? And what John is doing is creating a future for that stuff. So he's talking about taking human waste and turning it into aquaculture systems, and then using the offal from the aquaculture to do other stuff. Or he's talking about using waste from a sawdust mill or a brewery to grow mushrooms, and then using that spent medium to feed earthworms or red wriggler worms, and then using those worms to feed fish or other. And it's beautiful, and it is totally natural in a way. I understand why he would describe that as a machine in certain regards. But I just wanted to I spilled a little bit more words than I wanted to on this video, but I like including something that I think is at once promising and challenging and should keep you on your toes if you're paying attention to the subtleties of some of his language. Another one I noticed in there that I kind of questioned was rediscovery being framed as discovery. So that's something that Leah Penniman questions, I think, in the modern day permaculturalists who patent the term and think it was invented by two white Australian dudes in the 70s or whatever. And the term was surely, I guess, a portmanteau, new word made up of two other words. And if that's what a portmanteau means, I don't know. I'm trying to use fancy language I don't fully have command over. Anyways, that general blindness to the past, that historical forgetting that really, is borders on amnesia, and the sort of debilitating, disabling effects that an amnesia can have, or even a sort of Alzheimer's, a collective, we can assume it's a willed forgetting, but as the people who try to will forgetting note, at some point that willed forgetting becomes an unconscious, habitual forgetting. And to forget that permaculture is based on indigenous technologies, that this has all been done before, that, for 8,000 plus years, food forests have thrived in all different sorts of, at the very least, probably way, way, way more than that. To forget that isn't a way to disrespect the ancestors. I think one of Leah's anecdotes that I loved was about her being in Ghana, I think, and some of the queen mothers there, as she called them, really being shocked and surprised that the people in the United States don't pray over their seeds when they plant them and pour out libations and thank the ancestors and give offerings and etc. Set an intention, you could say in Western psychological terms, for the growth process. And the queen mothers go oh, no wonder y'all get sick. It's kind of crazy. You're not acknowledging the ancestors. You're not acknowledging that you want help from the gods and from the universe and from life to bring this seed forth, and you're not giving something where you're expecting to get but not giving. That's broken. That's that's gonna of course lead to sickness. That makes a lot of sense. And when what is essentially a rediscovery or a reframing or a recontextualizing of an indigenous practice is framed as discovery, which I think John does, and I'm picking on him a little bit because I think he just uses the term one time, but because my antenna were tuned by Leah's talk, I heard that and went, oh, interesting, that runs deep. He is running a company that is going into predominantly brown people's, although not exclusively, lands, it sounds like, or a lot of, Honduras and China, and I think he mentions other places. And Bolivia was one his son mentioned in another talk. And getting money from those, brown people to, and I'm sorry to put it so crassly racially, but to some extent you have to look at who are the business owners, who are the landowners in the dominant Western culture, of the United States and maybe Britain and some of these other Northern European countries and Canada and, the white nations. I don't believe that the predominance of those sort of my people, of individuals who look like me and come from similar heritage in these positions of power is a historical accident, and nor do I believe that it is because of some inherent superiority, although who knows, I probably still have plenty of white supremacy to root out from myself. But I do think the advantages granted to my people by a giant hundreds of year legacy of white supremacy are not to be ignored, one. And then two, when ecology starts to resemble coloniality, in other words, this white guy is getting paid to go tell brown people how to do things and fix up their situation, that I can't blame everything on colonialism, but in a sense a lot of the hardships and difficulties and even shitty sewer systems that were installed were based on Western models, were based on kind of applying realities from another context, applying monoculture crops from Northern European temperate zones, which kind of work in those zones, to areas where they're not appropriate, like the rainforest. doing that is something which we shouldn't just be unconscious about. And when he goes and his white-led company makes money off of those brown taxpayers to put in infrastructure for them, and when the World Bank does something similar, or the World Bank gives that country a loan, in other words, gives them made up money, and then tells them they have to pay it back at interest to these predominantly Western white banks, or even give some of that money to Western white owned corporations that then these brown people have to pay lots of interest on and continue to pay back not just the principal but also interest. Thank you. You know what I mean? Like there's even, his son pointed out an example of where these Western corporations come in and put in a sewage treatment plant that's going to involve regular purchasing of large quantities of chemicals from this same Western, civilization or even corporation, and that help was questionable. He then goes on to describe how his company is doing something different, and I believe him, and I believe that is a possibility, that there are different ways to do this sort of save the world, white saviorism on the ecological front. However, it's something to be vigilant about. It's something to question. It's something for myself as, reflecting on having gone through this course, reflecting on the faces that were seen and the voices that were heard. I have noted before this predominance of white landowning people. I think 98% of the farmland or some crazy fucking number is owned by white people in the U.S. And that's not just because, we're such hard workers. And Northern European winters made people have to save up, and save their ducats and then reinvest. And I don't know, maybe there are cultural things that make that, but I think the cultural thing that I would focus on first is colonial conquest, genocidal colonial conquest, pandemics and plagues and land degradation and things that went along with that colonial conquest and its style and its imperial core, which, as one of my favorite articles in the reading today, which we will get to in a moment, I'm going to speed this up a little bit, talks about. So that one is in the Dehesa section, the article I'm referring to. It also has stars by it. It's called The Lost Forest Gardens of Europe. That is the one where it talks about, just briefly, and it was like a light bulb for me, about how Roman colonial monocultures depended on slavery and thus had to create more war to get slaves. Anyways, long story short, your church trip to Africa to build toilets or whatever is a part of a colonial legacy. And that doesn't mean don't go to Africa and build toilets or whatever you think is saving the world. And I don't think this is limited to just white people need to watch out for this or be aware of this. I think Western scientific rationality has expanded some of these dangerous logics. And by dangerous, I don't mean cancel them. I don't mean never use any of them. I just mean think about, question, be open to, self-questioning that doesn't just freak out and go into, like, as many white people do when they are confronted with this, at least in my experience, they go to personalizations. Oh, you're talking about me, and I just can't, I don't feel like I can do anything about it, and I just feel blamed, and, and that's that white privilege, being unable to hear, being unable to listen to other voices that are saying, hey, we are dealing with I've gone on long enough. This is getting way too preachy. I'm gonna chill out on all this, but who am I to say what other voices are saying? I simply am saying, let's listen and let's do our best to, if I can listen by recapitulating some of this and saying things like I was attempting to say there, like, if I was to step into the other's shoes, our voices not being heard is a way to perpetuate the erasure and genocide in a new form. And your sense of white guilt and fear, or your rejection of the white guilt that you think we want you to have, is another form of that, as is your I'm going to save the world with my Western ideas of what the world should do or be or whatever. I think I just saw some really good material on Instagram, and I'll try to include that if I can dig back and find it, on how I'm blanking. I'm going to include that in the bottom with a little note on what it was, because I don't want to misquote this. So let's press on here. The Ahupua'a System. If we want to actually listen to and learn from some indigenous systems of land stewardship that provide a different model than, say, Western political and social and ecological science have enabled us, the Ahupua'a System of Hawaii seems like a great one. Now, from what I understand, it was introduced by King Kamehameha the Great in the mid-19th century, or rather, maybe not introduced, but spread to all of the islands and sort of codified. I'm not entirely sure, but I assume that it predates that universalization of it. I assume that it's something that was already happening, that was a practice. It sounds like it was a practice on the Big Island, on his island of Hawaii, and he kind of brought it to the rest of the rest of the islands. What I love about this, and so the first video that I have starred on here is one about a particular Ahupua'a on Maui by Clifford Naeole, and forgive me if I'm not doing those names justice, but he really talks about man or humanity as being a servant to nature, and nature being sort of this ruling chief. I think that the general context of, honoring the ancestors, and maybe Western science refusing to or not understanding the importance of, acknowledging the ancestors, acknowledging the past. Basically, the Ahupua'a System, sorry, I didn't really define this. I think we've talked about it a little before, but I really want to have a clear sense of what we're talking about here. So, it is a land division not based on arbitrary political distinctions. I'm drawing a line here, and you're, if you live on that side of the line, you belong to this people, and it's really not even, this people has been fighting this people, and, it's based on if you belong to this watershed, if the water falls on the top and it runs all down and it concentrates in an area and everywhere, this water is all focusing into a certain river, and that cutting through this valley. It's obviously, particularly made for the Hawaiian context in a way, geologically speaking, but I think the logic of you belong to the ecosystem that feeds you, the thing, the entity, the deity even that makes that system run is water. The deity that makes life run in this three-dimensional reality, or if not deity, the medium, the stuff of which life is made, is water. And in Hawaiian, as Dr. Kuiko Winter points out, and I think Clifford does as well, the word wai means water, YY, aka lots of water, means wealth. So they understood deeply, baked into the language, that water created the abundance that humans needed for full flourishing. And therefore, their political divisions, from what I understand, reflected that knowledge. To honor the land as well, and this is it gets into the system of kapu and sort of religious prohibitions on, say, going up and messing up or harvesting trees from the top of the hillside, where that was the sacred area. In general, he points out that honoring the land was akin to honoring the deities, because the deities would make themselves known, make themselves seen and present in the form of animals. And this allows not only you, but other people to survive. If you honor the land as you honor a deity, then that land provides to you with an incredible abundance, as a deity could provide to you. So that having that sort of respect is in contrast, or you can put that sort of in contrast with the notion of nature as dead and as sort of machinistic, And I guess, someone can really hip to AI and to new philosophy can question me on that and maybe teach me how machine does not equate to dead, how machine is living, and how, a mechanistic concept of reality could be a vitalistic concept at the same time. I'm open to learning, but I also am sort of maybe of the old school philosophy, at least right now, that, when you talk about something as a machine, you talk about it as an assemblage of parts which can do a function for you. And as functional as that concept might be, as much as it might work pretty well, to think like that, I think there's some dangerous additions to like stuff in there where it's just a bunch of dead parts. I can just take out one of the parts and remove it, and it doesn't matter. You know what I mean? Like, anything's replaceable. It's all fungible. It's all, why this obsession with non-fungibility, non-fungible tokens, NFTs, whatever. In part, it has to do with that our world is entirely fungible. That, it feels like the machine is trying to make everything, you can just switch out a part for another part, whatever, as long as it gets that function done. You in your job aren't essential to that work. You know what I mean? You could just be replaced by another laborer who's going to get paid the same, who's going to do the same essential function as you are in the system. That doesn't leave room for the personal, for the sacred, for the subjective in many senses. So again, I'm open to questioning here. I don't think that that's the final word, but that is kind of the background assumption that I'm working with when I hear Clifford talk about how nature was alive and how that granted a power to humanity's relationship with the land and kept those systems sustainable, beautiful, productive, massively more productive than they would have been without human intervention, just like the oak savannas of California that we studied earlier and we'll return to. Hopefully a lot. I actually have some ideas on videos I'd like to make on ways to sort of bring those back and revivify those and just share, solar punk imaginary in relation to California. But Hawaii is really inspiring. And so let's get into these next two videos on the Ahupua'a. Dr. Kawika Winter mentions specifically that this model of land management, this native watershed management, is a model worth exporting. This is indigenous knowledge as a sustainable export, as something that could literally help feed the world, just as an idea, because it's a great idea to understand our belonging to an ecological reality and understand that, in this case, say what happens at the top of the watershed affects everything that happens downstream of that watershed, and even vice versa. If you dam up the base of a river, it might impact a little bit, in terms of water flow right above it, but really what you're doing is you're stopping, say, fish, say salmon, up in Northern California from, or even there used to be salmon in Southern California from what I hear, from traveling up that river and spawning. And when they travel up that river and spawn, they provide food for all kinds of bears and eagles and wildlife along that river, who then actually take that, those nutrients from the ocean and walk out and poop and or die or whatever, and cycle all this phosphorus and nitrogen and etc. from the ocean back up onto the land, back up into the forest. Now, when you dam the bottom or you put, storm drains or whatever, and you prevent those salmon and other wildlife from going upstream, which happens in nature as well, you kill the forest. You take away a lot of the forest nutrient provision, that it used to depend on. So, anyways, essentially, I think Dr. Kawika Winter is spot on, and have said as much in my slideshow where I describe how the Ahupua System is something we could use to think about our own belonging to the LA Basin, to the greater watershed here. Another thing I loved about his talks were, one, that he pointed out, just to talk about one specific example, he pointed out how this intelligence system, essentially what permaculture does nowadays with zones, and I don't think we've really talked too deeply about zones, although this is a really foundational principle, or not principle, but a practice in permaculture design, is to think about zones. What are zones? Essentially, I want to design my life such that what is near me is the stuff that I use most, and what I need to use most, what I need to do most often is accessible, easily accessible to me. I can just go, if I like to eat greens, fresh greens every day, and if greens take some tending to, and if maybe they like a little bit of shade, I can have them right outside my back porch, my north-facing back porch where there's a little bit of shade. And every time I walk outside with my morning cup of coffee, I can take a look at them, see if they need anything. And anytime I'm in the kitchen and I want to grab something for dinner, I'll go grab it. Or my driveway, the walk from my driveway up to my kitchen, that's a classic example where I can just grab, I think Toby Hemingway mentioned that one, or I can just grab my greens on the way straight into the house, grab my herbs, whatever I'm going to use on a daily basis, I want it right there, right around me. Whatever takes daily care from me, I want right there, right around me. If my chickens need to be fed daily, easier if I put them right there, unless I have a way to automate that. If I have, say, chores that I have to do twice a week or three, or a little bit less often, then I could put them a little bit further away. And if I don't, if I don't really need to, tend to this fruit orchard, but a couple times a year, maybe in 2 fruiting cycles that it goes through or whatever, maybe I could have that a little bit further away, right? I don't need to be around that every single day. It doesn't need my attention like that. And then maybe there's, semi-wild lands where, I've got maybe livestock that don't need any care if I have the setup right, or maybe just kind of starting to transition into a wild zone, and then maybe zone 5 would be just totally native landscape that I let fallow and I don't do anything to, and I have it be a wildlife corridor, or I do very minimal management to help it flourish. So that's the permaculture idea of zones. And what Dr. Kawika Winter points out is that Ahupua'a was doing this, and specifically it was encoded in a religious, or I'm using the term religious to make sense of what might have been way more than religious, or way less than, or not religious at all in a contemporary Western sense of the term. But let's just say sacred prohibitions, things that were considered sacred and which you were not necessarily just allowed to do whatever you wanted. And it was understood that if you did something that contradicted those laws or those ideas, then you would be punished potentially by the gods. And so in that sense, I think the term is kapu. Certain areas were prohibited, were taboo, were off limits. So the tops of the mountains were kept totally free from human intervention. I think he said something, or somebody somewhere said, maybe the royals and the high priests at very special occasions would go into those sacred top layer cloud forests. What did that have the effect of doing is it allowed the watershed, the top of the watershed, the most crucial part of the watershed, to remain in forest, and therefore, and this is the part that's getting the most rain, it's often in clouds, to allow that moisture to slowly seep down through the stabilized soil that has roots in it, and the roots which allow that water to penetrate down into the soil rather than running off and taking topsoil with it and clogging up, mucking up the rivers, killing the fish, making algal blooms or silt, or blocking or damming the rivers. By keeping that top of the hill kapu sacred, they effectively managed their watershed very intelligently. They allowed for that slow water filtration to come down through the high forests and then form beautiful streams, instead of hacking it as they do nowadays down to grow grass to run cattle all over it, or something incredibly stupid. Greedy often, if not stupid, or ignorant, aggressive if not ignorant, if it's if you don't know what you're doing, I guess. Anyways, we're learning better. Collectively, we're learning about the intelligence that these native indigenous systems had, and that they might have framed in religious terms, for better or for worse, and which we can now have the option to reframe in our own language. But maybe preserving some of the sense of sacredness would be a great idea, I would argue. So yeah, another way in which these functioned, which I really love to hear about, was the fish blooms that were the fish ponds so let's just paint a picture from what I understand of these zones. You have the ocean, that's your refrigerator, that's where you go catch your fish primarily, and you got this giant source of, eels and shellfish and crabs and fish and big dolphins and all this stuff. Whatever Hawaiians ate, forgive me, I don't know all the details, in the ocean, zone 1. Or maybe a sort of modified zone 2 if we want to talk in permaculture terms. But going up the Ahupua'a, that would be your first zone. Then you have the shore, and I don't remember all the names. It's like Waukanaka and there's different names. He says them all. Check them out. These videos, by the way, are not in the playlist, so you have to click on them individually. But this is where you're living with your family. You're kind of close to the shore. You've got maybe your vegetable gardens around your house. Above that would be where you have your taro fields, and so what those are is a starchy root vegetable. It needs oftentimes a lot of water to grow, although there is dryland taro, I believe. And you'd have, so your stream come down the middle of the valley, the Ahupua'a, would be directed out into, say, irrigation ditches or channels that sort of winded in a long flat area. So, just like rice paddies or something in other climates. And this mineral-rich water that's been flowing through this agricultural field is gonna then flow down the river. So we'll get back to that in a second. Then say above that you'd have your food forest, right? Your fruit trees and all these kind of trees that you went up to gather whenever they were in season and bring down to eat. Above that, maybe you have the bird catcher zone, I think he said, where they didn't really intervene. Maybe there were a couple edible trees, but essentially that was just for the bird catchers to go catch their birds, pluck out the feathers, which at that point they didn't even kill early on. Before the introduction of guns, there was no bird murders. They just went up and did the very difficult task of capturing them and plucking their feathers, which were served as a sort of currency and or royal decoration for upper class people. Above that, I think you had the realm of the gods, essentially the sacred forest that you do not touch. All right, so going back down to say the second or third zone, the taro is growing zone. When that water is flowing through, it's all clean all the way through the food forest, maybe, or through the sacred forest and through the bird catcher zone, and maybe in the food forest it starts to get directed, I don't know, towards some of the trees or something. But in this agricultural zone now, it's really getting filled with silty mineral and life, organic matter rich water. That water then flows, and if it just flowed straight out to sea, you'd see what you have in the Gulf of Mexico, what you have in Florida sometimes right now, which is these giant algal blooms. Because this rich water that has all this organic matter stuff for fish to feed on, or for algae to feed on, it creates these algae blooms. The algae bloom, they suck out all the oxygen because they use it up with their metabolism, and you have oxygen-free zones in the ocean, which kill the fish. You have those dead zones. So, humans learn through trial and error. Maybe that might have happened at some point. Either way, what they designed was so brilliant, and it was to have fish ponds before the water went out to the ocean. While it's still full of all this living stuff, it goes into a fish pond that's, maybe a coral barrier or something like that is built to keep this fish pond separate from the ocean and keep it a little higher. And in that, you have herbivorous fish that could actually eat the algae as it blooms. As it blooms off that nutrient-rich water, you have fish that can eat that stuff and turn it into then usable protein. So you have a whole nother source of fish, maybe different sorts of fish, different, freshwater fish maybe, or estuarial sort of fish, eating that algae, cleaning the water essentially, as they do in modern aquaponic system, before the water is allowed back out into the ocean, into the refrigerator, as they called it, where they stored their food essentially. So plenty more on the Ahupua'a there for you to check out. I'd like to do some exploration myself of that in person. I would love to go to Hawaii, as I'm sure all of you would, and check this out myself. So if I can get that going, I'm going to make some videos and share what I learned more about that system. One quick video on just comparative watershed management in Monsoonal Flatlands, I called it. Sounds really geeky title, but I just wanted you to think about how the Hawaiian system is going to work in the Hawaiian context. This system in India, I believe, is not necessarily the same, but it's suited for its context. So in every context, we're gonna have a different system. But the Ahupua'a, I think, has some principles which are kind of universal, aka you belong to the ecology of your surroundings, you belong to the land. Know that, and maybe have your politics reflect that. So that's the brilliance of it, and that can be applied in many different ways. So this is another different way in which that's applied. These are more water retention ponds in a drier but monsoonally super wet landscape. So it's a little bit more extreme in terms of like a couple months of the year it's getting drenched and then there's nothing for a good chunk of time. So they have large ponds in which they store the water. I don't think so much for fishing so much as for agricultural use. Anyways, principle still stands, and hopefully you enjoy that one. That's a whole part of a whole series on watershed management in India by Andrew Millison, who's another great thinker in this stuff and educator. Then the sort of final section, or second to last section, is on the Dehesa, that southern Spanish oak savanna, managed oak savanna I was talking about earlier. Watch, at the very least, I think that quick 6-minute video, I don't even have a star next to it, but I would, just because it's cool to see what they're doing. And there's a really gorgeous 28-minute video with kind of funny, it's clearly translated from Spanish, I believe, so watch it in Spanish if you know Spanish originally. There's a version of it in Spanish on that channel, but I love it. I love Mediterranean food forest ideas in general, and this was super inspiring to me to learn about this. Thank you to that, who was it? Yeah, Dan Harris Pascal talk, the forest gardener, for turning me on to these. Then I have The Stars by the Lost Forest Gardens of Europe article, which I have a recording of. I would highly recommend you check it out yourself. If you can, and read the article, because the article has like cool slideshows and stuff, but I made it easy for you if you want. And then the last video is just another general idea on biomimicry, emulating nature and improving soil function by Ray Archuleta. He's one of the guys interviewed in the Kiss the Ground documentary. Great thinker, I really dig him. He's real low-key, talking to farmers, you know, sort of middle America straight talking a little bit, but not, you know, not super twangy accent sort of vibe of that. And crucial things that he says, I think, just to reiterate some ideas you've probably heard before from this course, but I needed to hear again. I'm hoping you benefit from hearing this again. Soil is biology, not geology. It is life in relationship with geology, hydrology, and cosmology. It's capturing, right, so it's lithophages and bacteria that can break down rocks and use the minerals in them, dialoguing with other organisms that can capture sunlight and capture carbon dioxide from the air and all these different things to make life structures and to make all this fascinating stuff happen. So, you know, lichens being fungal and bacterial, and like these, it's just fascinating to think about, to dive into the deep origins of life and think about how life emerges from geology. This unliving, just stable rock matter turns in somehow to soil. And soil is not just this dead dirt stuff, it is a living, breathing superorganism that we belong to in a way. We are extensions of. Ashes to ashes, dust to dust, from, you know, soil you to return, blah, blah, blah. So when we think of ourselves as capturing as much sun as possible to make more sugars, to make more life, to break down more geology, to make more soil, it's a very simple way of thinking about it, but it seems to me to be very powerful. And he essentially says the soil is naked, hungry, thirsty, and running a fever right now. And yet farmers and ranchers who seem to be part of the problem can also be part of the solution, and it can be more profitable for them. He says, you know, millennials are reading labels nowadays, and we're shifting our consciousness towards interconnections, and that's the sort of radical shift we need. So I've gone on plenty long. I appreciate y'all chilling and watching this, and hopefully it was informative, and hopefully you enjoy these videos and enjoyed the course. Please send me any feedback you'd like. Please let me know if you'd like to be on the later mailing list. As I said, I will send you one more super lecture of sort of, my summary and takeaways from the course, and maybe let's not use takeaways, my syntheses, my give untos from the course. So, all right, people, stay cool.